Bonjour, bon après-midi. Je suis Lebretichenko, commissaire public de CCA. Hi everyone, I'm Lebretichenko and I'm the Creator Public at CCA. I'm very happy to welcome you to this fourth lecture in our series, The Extended and Extended Family. These talks are part of our year-long project. It's called Catching Up with Life, which is organized around the question, as social structures evolve and their values and rituals change, how is architecture keeping up? So through many formats, a book, an exhibition, and now in this, we're investigating this, and now in this public program, we're focusing on family through an architectural lens. And we chose this topic because talking about family always ends up leading to talking about society. And since social definitions underlie most political positions, we thought this would be an interesting thread to pull on through a series of lectures. So for example, in the North American context, family values is a very loaded term. It's often used by right-wing politicians to activate anxieties about social change. Invoking the family can be a way of building a dynamic of inside and outside, native and foreign, private and public. And this kind of rhetoric is familiar to all of us because we're struggling today to address a global climate crisis and of course a pandemic, and struggling, I think, to decide whether to deal with it together or to take care of our own first. And I think many contemporary political positions could be sort of reduced to answers to the question, who do you consider part of your family? Of course, there have been always many different kinds of families, though only some were sanctioned by legal systems or celebrated in art or incorporated into architectural and urban imaginings as normal inhabitants for homes and cities. And today we're more aware than ever, I think, of this multiplicity, yet we're still living with an inheritance from a sort of social and physical inheritance of the 20th century, especially the myth of the nuclear family. And meanwhile, society and architecture are transforming at different rates, and parts of contemporary life are becoming misaligned, you can say, with the spaces they occupy. And one of the easier changes to identify is the acceptance of a greater variety of family configurations, something Naomi Stead has written about. What used to seem progressive becomes commonplace, what was daring becomes tame, what was queer becomes ordinary. Such are the processes of normalization, and such processes calcify in architectural form. So in this series, we hear from experts on historical encounters between architecture and ideas of the family, and their kind of case studies are juxtaposed with other talks, like today, that survey a more contemporary environment for evidence of changing or extended families. We began the series with the invention of the family room in the mid-century American suburb. Then we continued with a reading of boarding houses, which were a problematic phenomenon for the 19th century's emerging ideal of the bourgeois family and its home. And then we followed Venezuelan domestic workers from the back of their employers' houses through the Chavez Revolution. And today we continue with the theme of domestic workers, historically the most common kind of extended family and the one most ignored by architects. Joining us live from Mexico City is Frida Escobedo, an architect and designer whose work is especially interested in the reactivation of urban spaces, often considered residual or forgotten. And her projects include housing and community centers, hotels, galleries, and public art installations. She's taught most recently at Columbia GSAP and Harvard GSD. And I really want to thank Frida for joining us today.
Thanks so much for the introduction, Lev. Well, I'm going to start sharing my screen. And as you were mentioning, I have been doing some research and work for the past, let's say, 5 years in the topic of domestic labor and its implications on space. And this probably started when I had a conversation with Javier Nueno in 2017. And we were discussing this idea of what a satellite is in terms of architecture. And we started discussing it in terms of the movie Roma that was out in 2018. Roma is a movie that tells the story of Cleo, a domestic worker in middle-class Colonia Roma in the 60s. It was inspired by Alfonso Cuarón's domestic worker while he was growing up. So it's this story of familiarity, but also distance and the tensions between the family members, but also about the space. And I think that's quite fascinating. And in the movie, I think one of the characters becomes a house. We can see the house through different perspectives, and we understand how the main house actually has different layers to it, almost like a constellation of characters. And this is a floor plan that was drawn by Plan Croissant. And here you can see that actually it is a reproduction of a house in Colonia Roma. And it's not an original set. It was built to resemble one of these historical houses. And as you can see, the domestic quarters are always located in the back part of the house. They're at the end of the corridor. So they're within the household, but it's still almost like this moon that is surrounding a planet. And that's where the title domestic workers started making sense. It's almost like something that is orbitating between tension and distance. And I think it became a really relevant topic in 2018 because it was a year, of course, when this movie came out, and it became really successful. But also it was a year when domestic labor was recognized in Mexico City as formal work. And that had a lot of social implications because it was not just about formalizing the work, but also how other institutions such as Social Security or housing institutions would recognize all of these millions of workers who were out of the system at the time. But going back to where this all started, it was an invitation by Luciano Concheiro for this magazine, Hun, #1, and the title was Satellites. The theme of the magazine was to talk about these tensions between objects. And we were discussing initially how the work that I did for Ordos 100, a project that was about creating very experimental homes for a close community in Inner Mongolia in China. This is a project that was developed in 2007. How that really triggered in me the relationship between the space and domestic labor. And the reason why this happened is that when I received a brief for the project, on the list of items that we needed to design were 2 kitchens. And this became like really a surprise to me. Like I thought it was a mistake initially, but then someone explained that it had to do with this idea of like the wet kitchen and the dry kitchen. The wet kitchen is actually where the food is being prepared, and the dry kitchen is just representation. So that was like a revelation moment. I'm not gonna linger in this project too much, but then the whole articulation of the project became how to make 2 houses in one. Like this idea of the Russian doll, no? Like something that is almost like onion rings, and then the heart of the home, the fire, the center, or the gravitational center of the house becomes the functional kitchen, and then the other things revolve around it. So it's almost like creating the inverse layout than the Roma movie was presenting. Here are some of the floor plans, and as you can see, it's a very open plan. And it's almost invisible to understand where the domestic quarters are until you highlight them. So you can see that the unit that I proposed is a completely independent unit. It has its own courtyards, it has its own entrance, and the idea was to create like this softer envelope around it. So you can see that it's working in this concentric rings. But later, many years after, while I was doing one of the site visits with some of my students in one of the universities I was teaching at the time, we did a visit to Casa Estudio Barragán, and we noticed that there was a similar strategy or similar kind of logic of trying to conceal these domestic quarters. And to me, it became also a revelation moment because Estudio Barragán is probably one of the most iconic houses in Mexico. It was designed by Luis Barragán, who is our Pritzker Prize laureate. So everyone has seen this house, but few people have seen the kitchen and the domestic quarters because they are concealed. So this started this conversation, and that was the publication that we decided to present in this number of Hun. The original drawings were just presenting Casa Barragán, but later Luciano suggested that maybe we should expand that investigation, and maybe we should work on how that kind of concealing or hiding of the domestic borders happens throughout architecture, not just by really prominent architects, but also by contemporary architects or even in neighborhoods, how that translates from the residential home into the multi-house family building, and then into how the city is actually configured. So we started working on this publication, News number 2, which is edited by III, or Instituto de Investigaciones Independientes, and Gato Negro Ediciones. And the number had 2 essays, one by Mauricio Patron and the other one by Alejandro Hernández Galvez. But the basic exercise was to do graphic cartography of this layering or this kind of tension that happens between domestic spaces and the rest of the house. And we studied like 4 main cases, the first being Casa Barragán, the second one, Mario Pani building. Mario Pani is also one of the most famous architects of modernism here in Mexico City. And then an anonymous building, which is located in Polanco, one of the wealthy neighborhoods here in Mexico City. And finally, something that has to do more with the relationships of the urban, which is Bosque Real, this very wealthy neighborhood in the periphery of Mexico City. And as you can see, the progression was like going from something that was completely encapsulated inside the house to something that started to become a little bit more independent, almost like a peninsula, finally an island, and then like completely different worlds in the urban space. So the exercise was relatively simple. It was trying to highlight all of the architectural strategies that actually help to conceal these domestic spaces. So for example, in the case of Casa Barragán, there are a number of smaller rooms that you can see here and here that are composed of different doors that allow for the choreography to the house to happen without it being noticed by some of the users of the home. So for example, if you have some visits, someone can navigate through the kitchen and into the courtyard without actually entering the hallway of the house. And that to me was really interesting, like how actually there were spaces that were designated for that function, for the sole function of creating an invisible movement throughout the house. So as you can see, these were just presented in a map, and then some other strategies that were not even physical, but had to do with something that was spatial. For example, these doorbells that were positioned on the more traditional tables, which even erase the sound of the typical or traditional bell that is used to call the cook, so dishes can be served again. So this kind of technological or mechanical or architectural revelations were presented in this document. I think this is also a very beautiful photograph by Iñaki Bonillas from an exhibition he did also at Barragán House called Secretos or Secrets. So it's revealing these kind of minuscule things that actually create a lot of tension within the household. And then like moving through different layers, we finally arrived to something that was, you know, like more into the urban scale. So I'm going to share like the small project, which is Casa Estudio Barragán, but then what happens on an urban scale. So this is Bosque Real, and one of their merchandising campaigns, as you can see, it says like, I live in Bosque Real, where do you live? Assuming that there are 2 different worlds in Mexico City, you know? Like one where wealthy people can live, and the rest where the rest of us should be hiding. And as you can see, the presentation is that you have a neighborhood that is facing this bucolic landscape. It's almost like the city was erased in itself, and you only see a beautiful golf course and the mountains. But that is actually not the reality of this neighborhood. What you can see here is the master plan of the project, and it is fully surrounded by very dense neighborhoods. Actually, there's a very clear distinction between the neighborhood right next to it, and the golf course. And this might look like a photoshopped image, but it's not. This is the actual contrast that is happening in that place. And what is interesting to me is that the same strategies that were happening in Barragan's home, maybe without even like being intentional about it, it was just like following the tradition, happen in the urban scale. As you can see, there's this road that leads to a small space right here, which is this entrance. So it reveals the relationship between the back door or the back of house and the front of house. Of course, the main entrance of the compound is completely different to this one. This used to be one of the service entrances while the neighborhood was being under construction. Currently, this wall is way higher, so you don't even see the inside of the compound anymore, but the door is still there. So this is the kind of relationship between negotiation and codependency. You know, like we need each other, but at the same time, we're trying to deny visibility to some of them. So there is this very important question now when we start thinking about like how these 2.4 million workers in Mexico City, 90% of which are women and lacking basic rights, what is going to happen to them now that they're being recognized as part of the social security and the housing projects that we will have in Mexico. I think it's a very important opportunity to try to reconsider what is happening within the spaces inside the home, but also what is happening to the institutions. And then there's this whole other discussion about how reproductive labor actually has an impact not only on the houses of the domestic workers' workplace, but also in their own homes. There's this system of the chain of care, which means that the domestic worker is actually leaving their own children to take care of someone else's child. And that has implications in their own families, meaning that the next most vulnerable person, usually a woman, is going to take care of their children or their sick or their elderly. So that kind of negotiation between something that happens only in the domestic realm, but now also in the institutions, is a very important question. I think one of the most interesting sculptures in one of the public health system in Mexico City is this example. This is the main facade of IMSS, the Social Security institution in Mexico City. And IMSS had this program where a lot of artists were invited to create like this new identity. It was really important for the state to communicate what the ideals behind the Social Security were. And the work of Jorge González Camarena is presented in this facade. And I find it fascinating because the sculpture is it's called Work and Maternity. It's flanking the main entrance, and as you can see on the left side, we have the representation of work, meaning that all the manufacturing workers would have access to this kind of social security. On the right side, we have the maternity, but it's also representing agriculture. So all agriculture workers and factory workers would have access to the social security. But then there's a third element, and this is the feminine representation within the space. And feminine representation is motherhood, and only motherhood that allowed women to become part of the system. I mean, of course, this is not necessarily black and white. Of course, there were women who were dedicated to agriculture or work that could be incorporated into that force. But I find it a very powerful image because it really represents the need for the care of the children to be recognized as part of our economic system. No, it's a huge part of the economy, and I think it hasn't been truly recognized, especially with this chain care transfer. No? So what is going to happen when all of these domestic workers are incorporated into that work labor? Are we going to require new forms of institutions? Is this going to be something that we will need to reconsider? What is going to happen to schools and also, for example, syndicates or unions? No? When we were analyzing this kind of work during one of the studios at Harvard GSD, one of the exercises was to think about what the union headquarters for domestic workers could look like or should be articulated like. And one of the results was that it was a completely different format from what we would see here on the left side of the workers. No? I think it had to do more with open spaces, with the idea of being able to combine motherhood or the care of others with work, because life and work is always combined. So the results are very interesting. And I think this could be one of the reasons why maybe we should resignify not just the domestic architecture, but also the institutional one. So I don't know, Lev, if you want to jump into a conversation, or we want to go back to some of the images so we can expand on the theme.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think to arrive here, the one question that I I wanted to open up is like, as an approach, I think by looking at these sort of hidden spaces, especially in canonical buildings like this one, is part for me of a more general interest today in revealing sort of hidden parts of maybe everyday spaces, everyday systems. And I guess I'm curious if you see your work doing this, and also maybe if you want to talk more generally, like, why do you think we're interested in this today? Why do you think we're interested in the kind of exploring what is normally unsaid? What is the relevance of it for you?
Well, I think one of the important questions is why we keep doing this. No, I think when we had these examples of more traditional architecture, like the hacienda, no, I think that was one of the influences that most people recognize in the work of Barragan, but it's always about the proportions, the colors, the materials. But we forget that there's some like strategies that have to do more with the configuration of space rather than those elements that put together, like the puzzle pieces. And I think even if this is, for example, not a typical courtyard home with a separate quarters for the domestic workers, it still keeps that kind of thinking within something that was revolutionary in many ways. No, like it was revolutionary in the use of proportion of light, the windows, the colors, everything. But at the same time, it was re-articulating something that was highly traditional. And what is really surprising to me is that every time we try to create new architectures, I mean, we have seen the work of Mario Pani, and in his example is exactly the same thing. No? Like he's doing the first condominium building in Mexico City, but at the same time, he's keeping the domestic headquarters hidden from the view. And the only way to enter those spaces is, for example, through the parking space. It doesn't have any entrance from the street. And it creates like this dependency that in my opinion, is highly patriarchal. No, like it depends way too much on this idea that we're protecting this type of labor, and it's not an independent thing. As we move into more contemporary examples, we continue to see how over time these spaces not only do not disappear, but they become worse. You know, like now the tendency is to have the domestic quarters, for example, behind the laundry room, and the only way to enter it is through the kitchen. So we did an analysis in a tower in one of the new neighborhoods in Mexico City, and we found out that the configuration was really interesting. It was like a round circular floor plan, And the installations were, of course, close to the core of the building, like the service elevator, the regular elevator, the escalators, all the risers for the plumbing. And then at the center of the building, there were the domestic quarters, then the laundry, then the kitchen, and then you moved into the rooms, and then the final ring was the public spaces, such as the dining and the living room. No, so those were the ones that had like the better view. But it was really telling because it was almost perceived as domestic labor was part of the infrastructure of the building. And I think it's something that hasn't disappeared. The question is like this example or these exercise of domestic orbits that we did for news was not an attempt to make any judgment, because then you start analyzing, well, what happens if you remove those quarters from the domestic home and actually people start to commute and have their own homes. But the city is so heavily divided and polarized that it becomes then a question of the tension between the time and the distance. No? So these peninsulas that start forming islands not necessarily are better than the first examples that we saw. So it was just an attempt of trying to analyze like these moments where the tension actually erases and the familiarity is gone, and then all that is left is distance.
Yeah, the previous talk, Valentina really went into that problematic of time. Well, no, I think that's a very interesting point, and already made me think your classes must have been. It's such an interesting approach, because somehow to take it as an example of, here is a sort of you could say progressive step, as you say, experimental step. Paradigmatic step in architecture, and yet inside it is actually a very conservative, very patriarchal kind of logic embedded still, and almost, you could say, invisible if you don't know how to look. And I feel like that's a very strong approach today, when I think there's many kind of ethical things on the minds of especially young architects, and I don't know, in terms of climate change, labor relations, things like that, and somehow learning that the relationship between the sort of formal logics and those other ones, those infrastructural ones, is not clear or as simple perhaps as we want it to be. I guess I'm curious also, what do you think is your role, or maybe better, your responsibility in this as an architect? I mean, because so much of this is a kind of social political question. So what do you see as kind of your public for this work, but also maybe your hopes for it?
Yes, I mean, I think to me it was an interesting exercise, for example, this first one of Ordos, no? Like this idea of, this was never realized, no? So this was a project that was just a project, but to me it was something that really triggered this understanding that actually the people who stay the most time at the home are the ones that we don't see necessarily as users, just because they're not the owners. And that's a critical question to me now, no? Like, because we're used to dealing with that with public spaces. We never know who the final user is going to be. It's almost like you kind of guess what is going to happen in the space, but you're never know for sure. And what happens when you have a residential project is that you have a very close relationship with the client. You understand their expectations, their desires, their needs, their phobias, no? Like you become almost like a therapist slash engineer that can create this little world for them. But there's a specific user who is going to use a house probably more than anyone else. I mean, given the conditions at least in Latin America, that we don't know, we don't understand, and we are usually not aware about. So now every time we're starting to think like, well, what are the working conditions? What is the average size of cleaning closet? Is it next to the spaces that need to be cleaned or not? How can we make things a little bit more practical? And so we can reduce the labor. No, I think one of the most important lessons that we learned from the Domestic Workers Union here in Mexico City is what they're trying to achieve by making this union is to redistribute the domestic work, to reduce it, and to make it recognized. So these 3 R's become really essential when we're designing now. No, like if we are able, by making some subtle changes in the infrastructure of the house to reduce the labor, then it's a go. If there's some moments where we can create moments of relaxation or like quietness or contemplation for these other users, we will do it as well. No, so now we're thinking all the time about like making smaller courtyards, a private space, to consider what happens when these workers have a specific age, because this is another issue that we never talk about. Usually domestic workers who are women are between, let's say, 18 and 60 years old. And that is the reproductive moment as well. But also this is the moment where they have like their partners and their sexual lives going on. And usually that is also erased from this kind of dynamic. No, if you're living in someone else's house, how can you have a relationship? How can you have children? How can you have friends? How can you have family? So all of these considerations that may even be resolved with the idea of having a private moment, I think are important to take into account.
Follow-up question, but I see there's one on YouTube from Mariana. Fascinating talk and a pertinent subject. I wonder if you have thoughts on how architects might be able to shape a new agenda for domestic work in bringing it out of hiding.
Well, I think there are some great opportunities, and I think one of the exercises, again, that we did at the GSD was really interesting. Well, the scope of the work at the GSD was to investigate domestic labor, but each one of the groups looked at it in a very different perspective. So one of the teams decided to analyze all of these high rises for housing that are starting to appear throughout Mexico City. And these are like massive buildings, like 20 stories or more, maybe 300 units and beyond. And what they did was to actually start marking the footprint of the domestic quarters, taking that square footage into account, and then thinking what would happen if instead of it being pulverized throughout the building, it became almost like a building within a building. Very similar to the Barragan strategy, like we have a home and then it's embedded into one. So why don't we have two types of building within one? So one is a little bit more, compact. So maybe they're smaller studios, but the domestic workers actually have their own private space, their own entrance. And that actually created very interesting conditions with the neighborhood too, because you have now two different economies, two different lifestyles within the same neighborhood. So for example, there was an opportunity for the small shops or the bodegas to survive because the building wouldn't gentrify the neighborhood as much. There would still be opportunities for the old neighborhood to survive, and then the gentrification process would probably withstand the test of time a little bit more. So there's these relationship between having a more mixed type of community within the neighborhoods that is not so polarized between one section of the city and the other. So I think that was a very smart way to think about it. And then there was this other question of what the amenity spaces for these buildings were. Many of the amenity spaces have to do more with aspiration. So for example, we find a lot of examples where we have a swimming pool, a gym, even a library, a library that no one uses, or at least not before the pandemic when people started working more at home. It was more about projecting ourselves as something else rather than using those spaces. But when you understand that maybe having a childcare facility within the building would reduce the time that each one of these domestic workers spends with children, because when they're socializing, of course, less people have to take care of more children. So what would happen if that kind of dynamic shifted and we have these areas where, let's say, communal kitchens or communal childcare facilities started appearing? So that means that the labor within the home is reduced. There are more spaces that are being utilized, and therefore there's less empty spaces. And also there's an opportunity for, and this is like a very difficult social condition in many countries, but there's a possibility of engaging like also the children of the domestic workers, no? So they wouldn't be left alone. Mothers would be able to bring their kids home, and children would be able to socialize between each other. So I think, I mean, there are many ways of trying to incorporate this kind of communal spaces.
It's very interesting to talk about amenities, and also your comments about the new tower and the sort of, you know, splitting of the spaces and providing kind of privacy and these things. To me, makes me think of the almost tension between a sort of idea of amenities and of a sort of maybe more formal or material kind of dignity, because I think not from these kind of projects, but from others that I know in North America, you might have kind of two classes, you could say, of cost, which turn into classes of people in a sense in the same project, and it's all sort of obvious. You know, there's sort of different doors, there's different materials being used, floor heights are reduced, maybe there's no balconies, these kind of things. But there's still a certain amount of amenities that are produced. So I think that's it's very interesting. I feel like splitting the two kind of populations in one building also makes that possible for the first time to be able to really compare, because it sort of forces this contradiction, you could say, or this contrast to come out in the open. And I'm curious, as more and more of these, you know, get built, like what will be some of the consequences of that? As you say, integrating more with the community is one of them.
But I think there's also, I mean, now that you mention it, I mean, this is very common in Latin America, no, the idea of domestic labor, of paid domestic labor. I did a workshop, Dessau, for the anniversary of the Bauhaus, and I used this as an exercise. And one of the students mentioned, like, well, that happens only in Latin American countries, you know, like I live with my partner and we don't have any sort of help within the house. And the question was like, okay, so let me ask you one question. Like, you do your laundry and you probably do the cleaning of your own home, but do you cook all of your meals?
Right.
And the answer was no. And my question was like, well, do you know where your food comes from? And these kind of invisible strategies that happen within the house for paid domestic labor are completely transferred into a different kind of economy. So it's not as easy to get rid of it as we think it is. When we start thinking like, well, I really don't know who's preparing my food, and you start looking at like these delivery systems or the food chains that appear, usually the kitchens are again like places of displacement and places of some people who have less advantages to work. No, so for example, there's now the system of distribution, you know, like Uber Foods or all of these Kangaroo or all of these new brands. And usually what you think is like, I'm going to get my food directly from the restaurant that I used to go. And that is not the case. They have like these satellite kitchens scattered throughout the city, probably in like the most unthinkable places, no? Like, for example, underneath a bridge or an overpass. And these are temporary kitchens where the food is being prepared that are completely invisible to our sight. They have no physical space in our understanding of the city, but they still are there. And this is a different kind of invisible labor that we have.
Yeah,
So,
dark kitchens called here. Totally. I mean, I think the North American example is that we have all these workers essentially, but it's much more of a temporary kind of very momentary relationship with them, and they're spread around the city. And the relationship is much more corporatized. It's not a personal relationship with someone. It's going through an app or a service of some kind. Yeah, that for me is one of the most interesting parts of your work, is that, as actually it's nice you're moving through the slides as I'm saying this, it's the kind of smooth way it goes between talking about the plan of a particular building and the sort of domestic scale to the urban implications, or you could say like the urban resonance of the same attitudes. So I guess, I mean, what do you think is the future of this? And also, do you see sort of counterexamples or other examples in other countries where something kind of positive is emerging that you would like to cultivate?
I think, I mean, we were just finishing the course at the GSD. We had the publication in the bookstores at the time the pandemic started. And to me, it was a really interesting moment because this was the first time that we had to really start working in our homes. No, like most of us like did that sporadically, but this was the first time that, for example, Zoom allowed to other things to happen. This was the first time where children would appear like every now and then in meetings, or you would see dirty dishes on a sink. On something that would be previously considered as a formal setting, not like a meeting. So to me, it was really fascinating to see how, for example, some things appeared like fake bookshelves that you could buy online. You know, this idea of having a background that would clean out like the real life of the home to make it look more professional. And then on the other side, like the assumption of like, well, this is the new reality now, no? So people started like dressing up at the beginning of the pandemic, like just wearing like shirts or sweaters. And then there was like this joke, no, like a nice top on the top and then pajama bottoms. But I think it has like this duality also with the relationship with between domestic labor and what we call productive labor, or reproductive labor and productive labor, which I think are part of the same thing. And that kind of understanding between one and the other is what we need to reconsider. Sadly, I thought that this was going to really shift, for example, the developers' ideas of how we should think about the home, but also how to think about the territory in general. No, like, are we still fixated in creating financial districts and suburbia? Or this is something that really needs to end, because what we're seeing now is that the best option would be to have less office spaces because people are still going to be working in their home places. So maybe this is more like a hybrid, no, like more meeting rooms, but also more space at home to be able to have, you know, like a quiet moment of concentration, but also to be able to take care of these things that we used to delegate to other less privileged people. And now that we're understanding to live more closely to all of these activities that actually support life, maybe we can give them a new value, no, and reconsider what the true cost of all these support of the economy is. So it's starting to think about like how they should not be subsidizing our lives anymore.
Absolutely. I think this comes back to the sort of overall theme of what can be revealed and the sort of social political implications of simply having to face how things really are when so much of, especially our cities, are based around, I think, hiding them. And also the point you're speaking about earlier of you know, having more room and taking care of more things at home. As you were talking about these new typologies, I was thinking this with domestic workers. I was thinking how similar it sounds to sort of emerging trends in multi-generational housing, which also, you know, brings about those kind of relations. There was another question though on via YouTube, much more active today than Zoom, by actually Valentina, our previous lecturer. Thanks for your presentation. I would like to ask about the position of the kitchen in these houses. Do you see them as a place designed for the domestic workers or for the housewife? What does the kitchen position and materiality say about the family dynamics?
That's an excellent question. And I mean, right now, I only have the example of Casa Barragan. And for sure, this is an example where it was for the cook, not necessarily some owner that enjoyed or did any sort of cooking. And you can see it because it's relegated to the less privileged area of the home. So probably someone who enjoyed eating and gathering, because you can see it like, you know, like the size of the table, its relationship to the garden, the proximity to the living room space. But then the kitchen, even the configuration, oh, sorry, it's a little bit weird, no? Like we can see that the distribution is not completely functional. We have the sink far away from the stove, probably because also there were technological changes throughout the time, but it really speaks about like someone who's less involved in that kind of process. And I've seen more recently some examples where we think like, oh, now there's a shift because we have like these open kitchens with islands, no? And this becomes like a more direct relationship between inside the kitchen and the living spaces. So this is great. This is going to actually help to unlock this condition. But it's not necessarily the case. There's a very interesting essay by Tanya Harp. I think it was part of her thesis for Berkeley University. And she's analyzing the relationship between the amount of work that is required in a closed kitchen versus an open kitchen, and how this is not really recognizing what is happening in the kitchen, but almost extending the social or living room areas into the kitchen space. So they become almost like the dry kitchen that I was describing for the Ordos house, no? So we can see that kind of floor plan. And you can see it here, where the actual kitchen, well, it's a little bit more functional, more compact, but it has to do more with efficiency. And then the open kitchen becomes almost like a display, no? Like a buffet or an open bar, but it's not necessarily how kitchens work. And so there's a lot of work required to maintain them in that kind of openness. So it's interesting to see what's going to happen there.
No, I think it's a great insight. I think the sort of loft open kitchen really plays into a sort of a trend for hiding. No, I mean, it only looks good when it's completely clean. It only looks good when it's somehow completely staged. When the sort of delivery boxes have all
exactly
thrown away. So yeah, I think every sort of, I mean, it's nice to see it in this plan, because I think the sort of fantasy life that is sold in a lot of sort of contemporary, especially very small, financialized building, with there's lots of it going on now in Montreal, for example, is actually there's like an implied dark kitchen, right? Like it's so obviously impractical what's been actually built, that there's a whole other infrastructure that it requires. But before wrapping up, I'm curious, Frida, from looking at the other talks in the series, I don't assume you've watched them all, but I'm curious how you sort of look at family now in architecture, sort of taking this lens. What do you think of this topic, and sort of what would you like to know more about it?
I think what you mentioned is really interesting, no? This idea that the family is not just consanguineal, but also the extended family has to do with other types of relationships. I think the idea of like this patriarchal, heterosexual family of mom and dad, children, is something that we really need to reconsider, no? Like families come in like different shapes and sizes. I think we mentioned this on the other videos, but now probably there are like very big cities that actually have a different configuration of families, no? Like for example, New York City, which is a city that has a lot of rotation. Probably the most common tenant in New York City would be young people who have roomies, no? And that is like some sort of a temporal association of people that create like a different type of household. So why do we keep insisting on having an architecture that is designed for these biparental family structures, instead of thinking about new ways of conviving? No, like why are residential projects in the US, especially in these like big cities, still focused on providing like a kitchen, a dining, a living, and a room, when probably a kitchen is not necessary anymore because people are eating out or ordering food. And instead, why don't we have communal kitchens and childcare, which would facilitate a lot of the displacement between the workers and and the families. No, I think that's one question. And then the other one on the other side of the spectrum is the extended family. No, like we usually don't think that families live together, like grandparents, aunts, children, and even like other relatives that come from like farther out. No, so. And then the in-betweens, no, like what is a family now, if not someone you choose to live with, and that constantly changes. So the spaces should be a little bit more flexible, and maybe it has to do with the exchange value and not the use value. So we start focusing more on the use value. I'm sure the configuration of the house will change, but that's probably something that we would need to start teaching and at least the master's degree at real estate development in some schools, no?
I agree. I think it's a fascinating topic. I was going to say, I'm glad you ended with that, because I think the point is to produce different kind of developers rather than just to encourage citizen architects who otherwise might have a hard time finding someone who agrees with privileging use value over exchange value at this time. But thank you so much, Frida, for a really interesting conversation and sharing your work with us. Thank you all very much. Merci beaucoup, and see you next week.